Close your eyes, or let them rest softly on the horizon of your imagination. Tonight, we travel back across 8 centuries, across vast steppes of golden grass that stretch without end beneath a sky so wide and so deep it feels like the ceiling of the world itself. We travel to a time before the borders that divide our modern maps existed, to a land where wind was the only law and survival was the only prayer. We travel to the birthplace of the largest contiguous land empire the world has ever known, and we begin, as all great stories must begin, at the beginning. This is the story of Temujin, the boy who would become Genghis Khan. Settle in, breathe slowly. Let the images come gently like the first light of dawn spreading across the Mongolian plateau. There is no rush. The steppe has always been patient, and tonight so are we. Part 1. The World Before the Khan. Chapter 1. The Steppe and its People. To understand the man who changed the world, we must first understand the world that made him. The Mongolian steppe is one of the most extraordinary environments on the surface of the earth. It is a place of extremes, where summer temperatures can climb to searing heights and winter cold can plunge so deep that rivers freeze solid, and the very ground beneath your feet becomes hard as iron. It is a place where the sky dominates everything, where clouds move in great caravans across the horizon, where lightning storms illuminate the flatlands in theatrical flashes of white and purple light. It is a land that offers everything and nothing at the same time. Endless space, endless sky, endless wind, and very little shelter from any of them. The people who made their homes on this steppe were nomadic. They did not build cities. They did not plant fields. They moved with the seasons, following the grass, following the water, following the animals that sustained their lives. Their homes were round felt tents called jurs, structures of extraordinary ingenuity, capable of being assembled in under an hour, packed onto the backs of horses and camels, and carried across hundreds of miles of open country. Inside these jurs, families of 4, 5, 6 or more would sleep, eat, pray, argue, love, grieve, and dream. The hearth at the center of the jur was the heart of the home, and the smoke that rose through the circular opening at the top carried prayers up to the eternal blue sky that the Mongols called Tengri. Tengri was their god, or at least the highest expression of the divine they recognized. Not a god with a human face and a throne in some distant heaven, but a living force, a presence felt in the movement of the wind, in the arc of an eagle overhead, in the turning of the seasons. The Mongols also honored the earth goddess Etugin, and they believed that spirits inhabited rivers, mountains, trees, and fire. Their shamans, men and women called Bu and Udgan, served as intermediaries between the human world and the spirit world, performing rituals to heal the sick, to ensure good hunting, to bring rain, to ward off evil. This was a world alive with invisible presence, where nothing was purely material and everything carried meaning. Life on the steppe was hard in ways that are difficult to imagine from the comfort of a modern bedroom. Infant mortality was devastating. Disease swept through camps without warning or mercy. Winters killed, droughts killed, raiders from neighboring tribes killed. A man who lived to see his 50th year was considered old. A woman who survived multiple childbirths was considered strong. Children who made it past their 3rd winter were considered the lucky ones, the ones whom the spirits had chosen to keep. And yet, from this hardship, a culture of remarkable sophistication had emerged. The Mongols were among the finest horsemen the world had ever produced. They learned to ride almost before they could walk, and by the time they were adolescents, a young Mongol could control a horse with his legs alone, leaving both hands free to draw and loose a composite bow with devastating accuracy. Their bows were marvels of engineering, made from layers of wood, bone, and sinew glued together under tremendous pressure, capable of driving an arrow through armor at distances that seemed impossible to their enemies. A Mongolian archer on horseback could loose 10 arrows per minute while riding at full gallop, and he could hit a target at 150 meters with terrifying consistency. They were also remarkable herders. Their 5 sacred animals, horse, sheep, goat, cow, and camel, provided them with everything they needed. Milk became arag, the fermented mare's milk that was their ceremonial drink, warm in the belly and slightly intoxicating, the taste of celebration and of sorrow. Wool became felt for their jurs and clothing. Blood became emergency food in desperate times. Leather became saddles, quivers, boots, ropes, and containers. Dung became fuel when wood was scarce, which on the open steppe was almost always. The social structure of the steppe was built on kinship, loyalty, and fear. At its most basic level, the unit of organization was the family group, the household that shared a jur or a cluster of jurs. Families grouped into clans, and clans grouped into tribes. The leader of a tribe was called a khan, a word meaning ruler or lord, and his authority was earned through a combination of birth, prowess in battle, skill in negotiation, generosity toward his followers, and the ability to attract loyal men to his banner. A khan who could not protect his people would not remain a khan for long. A khan who could not provide for his followers, who could not share the spoils of raids and hunting, who could not keep alliances alive through gift-giving and hospitality, would find his camp empty one morning, his followers having slipped away in the night to join a more capable lord. This was the world into which Temujin was born, sometime around the year 1162 of the Common Era, on the banks of the Anan River, in what is now northeastern Mongolia. Chapter 2: The Father and the Blood Eagle. His father's name was Yesuje, and he was a man of some standing among his people, the Borjigin clan of the Mongols. Yesuje was not a great khan, not the ruler of a vast confederation of tribes, but he was a respected warrior and leader, a man known for his courage and his cunning. He had allies among neighboring clans and enemies among them too, as was the nature of steppe politics. The story of Temujin's birth is told with a detail that the Mongols considered deeply significant. On the day that Temujin came into the world, his father Yesuje had returned from a raid against a rival people called the Tatars. He had captured a Tatar warrior named Temujin Yuj, and in the custom of his people, he named his newborn son after his most important captive, believing that the spirit and strength of the defeated enemy would pass into the child. This was not unusual among the Mongols. Names carried power, carried memory, carried the essence of things conquered and things desired. The baby Temujin was born, according to the Persian historian Rashid al-Din, holding a blood clot in his right fist, the size of a knuckle bone. This was interpreted as an omen of greatness, a sign that the child would grow to be a great warrior. Whether this detail is literally true or is the kind of retrospective legend-making that always attaches itself to great historical figures, we cannot know for certain. What we do know is that the child survived, which on the steppe was itself a kind of triumph. Yesuje had other children from his wife Holun and from other women, as was customary among Mongol leaders who often had multiple wives. Temujin had brothers Hasar, Hachion, and Temuj, and a sister, Temulun. He also had 2 half-brothers from one of his father's other wives. The family was not wealthy in the way we might understand wealth today, but they were not destitute either. They had horses, they had herds, they had a camp, and they had Yesuje's reputation and connections to lean on. When Temujin was around 9 years old, his father took him on a journey of great importance. It was time, Yesuje had decided, to find his son a bride. This was not unusual. On the steppe, betrothal agreements were made early, cementing alliances between families and ensuring that children would have partners waiting for them when they came of age. Yesuje was riding toward the camp of his own relatives, the Alkanut clan, where he hoped to find a suitable girl for his eldest son. But along the way, they stopped at the camp of a man named Day Sechin, a leader of the Anjarat tribe. And there, Yesuje saw a girl named Bort. Bort was perhaps a year or 2 older than Temujin, and by all accounts she was considered beautiful and composed beyond her years. Day Sechin was pleased by the idea of an alliance with the Borjigin clan. and he agreed readily when Yesuje proposed that Temujin and Bort should be betrothed. It was decided that Temujin would stay with the Anjurat family for a time, as was the custom, to become known to his future bride's family and to serve as a gesture of good faith. Yesuje rode home alone. On his way back, he stopped at a camp where members of the Tatar tribe were feasting. In the hospitality traditions of the steppe, travelers were fed and sheltered regardless of the host's feelings about them, and Yesuje sat down to eat and drink among the Tatars. But the Tatars recognized him. They had not forgotten his raids, and they poisoned his food. Yesuje rode on, but by the time he reached his own camp, he knew something was terribly wrong. He sent a man to fetch Temujin from the Anjurat camp, and Temujin arrived just in time to be at his father's side before Yesuje died. Temujin was approximately 9 or 10 years old. His father was dead, and his world was about to collapse. Chapter 3: Abandoned on the Steppe. What happened next to the family of Yesuje is one of the most important passages in the story of Genghis Khan, because it was in the years of abandonment and hardship that followed his father's death that the character of the future conqueror was forged. With Yesuje gone, his followers had no particular reason to remain loyal to his widow and children. A Khan's power did not automatically transfer to his son, especially not to a child of 10. The steppe operated on a stark logic of survival, and the men who had followed Yesuje began looking for new leaders to attach themselves to. One by one, then in groups, they left. Yesuje's brother, a man named Tadajin Gert, led his people away from Holan's camp, refusing to allow her family to share in the communal resources of the clan. Holan was left virtually alone, with 5 young children, 2 stepsons, and no men to protect or provide for them. What followed were years of desperate poverty. The family survived by eating whatever they could find: roots, berries, fish from the river, small animals caught in traps. Holan herself took up a digging stick and went out into the fields to root for food, a task so beneath the dignity of a Khan's widow that it speaks volumes about how completely the family had been abandoned. The boys learned to hunt, to set snares, to read the river for fish. They were, in the most literal sense, fighting for their lives every single day. These years did something to Temujin. They stripped away the soft assumption that the world was orderly and fair, that loyalty could be taken for granted, that the bonds of kinship were unbreakable. He learned that the world was not fair. He learned that power was the only real currency. He learned that the men who had abandoned his mother were not evil precisely, but were simply following the iron logic of the steppe, and that if he was ever going to amount to anything, he would need to offer his followers something more compelling than the memory of his dead father. He also learned something about himself. He was not willing to lie down and die. He was not willing to accept the role of the abandoned, the forgotten, the irrelevant. Something burned in him, something that would not be extinguished by cold or hunger or humiliation. There is a story told in the secret history of the Mongols, the extraordinary 13th century chronicle that is our most intimate source for the early life of Genghis Khan, about an incident during these years of poverty that reveals a great deal about the young Temujin's character and his future methods. Temujin and his brother Hasar caught a fish, and their half-brothers Begter and Belgute took the fish from them. This was not the first time Begter had taken things from Temujin, had undermined him, had acted as a rival rather than an ally. Temujin spoke to his mother about it, and Holan, exhausted and stressed by the endless struggle for survival, scolded him rather than taking his side. She needed all her children to hold together, not to fight. But Temujin had already made his decision. He approached Begter out in the open steppe and he shot him. Hasar helped. Together they killed their half-brother. When Holan found out, she was furious and grief-stricken. She compared her sons to wild animals, to dogs that ate each other. But Temujin's response, as recorded in the secret history, was cold and certain. Begter had been a rival. Rivals were dangerous. The world was not large enough for both of them. This was the first killing in Temujin's life that we know of. He was perhaps 12 or 13 years old, and it tells us something essential about the man he was becoming, capable of terrible decisiveness, willing to act where others would hesitate, able to set aside sentiment when survival or power demanded it. Chapter 4: Captivity and Escape. The years continued to be hard, but Temujin was growing. He was becoming a young man, lean and hungry and watchful, with the pale eyes that contemporaries would remark upon, and that gave him an unsettling, penetrating gaze. He had survived the abandonment of his clan, the death of his father, poverty that would have broken most people, and now he was beginning to think about how to climb back to something like the position his family had once held. But the steppe had one more lesson to teach him before it would let him begin his ascent. The Taechiat clan, who were distant relatives but had been rivals of Yesuje, had long looked upon Temujin with anxiety. They could see that this boy was not going to stay small and powerless forever. He was too fierce, too determined, too much his father's son. And so they sent a raiding party to Holan's camp, and they captured Temujin. He was put in a kang, a wooden collar device worn around the neck and extending outward, making it difficult to sleep or lie down comfortably and impossible to feed oneself without help. He was passed from household to household within the Taechiat camp, a prisoner, a slave, a symbol of their dominance over the remnants of Yesuje's line. But Temujin watched. He learned. He studied his captors, memorized their habits, identified the ones who seemed sympathetic or at least indifferent. And one night, during a summer festival when the Taechiat were celebrating and their attention was divided, Temujin made his move. He struck one of his guards with the wooden kang he wore, knocking the man down, and ran into the darkness. He hid in a river, submerged to his neck in the cold water, concealed among the reeds. The Taechiat searched for him, and one man found him, a low-ranking member of the clan named Sorkin Shira, who had been kind to Temujin during his captivity. Sorkin Shira looked at the young prisoner hiding in the river and made a choice. He pretended not to see him. He went back and told the searchers that Temujin was not in that part of the river. Later, Temujin crept to Sorkin Shira's jur and asked for help. The man fed him, filed off his kang, and helped him escape, hiding him in a cart of wool until the search had moved away. Then Temujin rode out into the steppe and back toward his family. This episode taught Temujin several things he would never forget. It taught him the value of winning the loyalty of individuals at every level of society, not just the powerful, but the humble, the overlooked, the ones whom no one else thought to cultivate. Sorkin Shira would later be rewarded generously by Genghis Khan, and his descendants would be among the honored families of the Mongol Empire. It also taught Temujin that he could survive the unsurvivable, that he could endure captivity and humiliation, and emerge from it not broken but harder. Chapter 5: Board Alliance in the First Test. Temujin was now a young man in his mid-teens, returned to his family, free from the Taechiat but still essentially powerless on the broad steppe. He had his mother, his brothers, a few horses, and whatever his own intelligence and determination could construct for him. It was not much. But he had not forgotten Bort. He rode to the camp of Day Sechin of the Anjarat tribe, who had waited patiently through the years of hardship, honoring the betrothal agreement made with the dead Yesuje. Bort was there, grown now, perhaps 16 or 17 years old. Temujin and Bort were married. Bort brought with her a wedding gift that would prove enormously consequential, a coat of fine black sable fur. It was a luxurious, beautiful thing, the kind of object that had real value on the steppe as a gift to cement alliances. And Temujin knew exactly who he wanted to give it to. There was a man named Togrul, the Khan of the Karait tribe, one of the most powerful rulers on the Mongolian steppe. Togrul and Yesuje had been Anda, sworn blood brothers, the deepest form of friendship and alliance the steppe culture recognized. Temujin went to Togrul and reminded him of this bond, offering the sable coat as a gift, and asked to be taken under the older man's protection. Togrul accepted. He would become Temujin's most important early patron and ally, a relationship that would define the next decade of Temujin's life, and that would eventually end in tragedy and war. But before any of that, there was a catastrophe. The Merkits, a powerful tribe from the north, had an old grievance against Holun. Years earlier, Yesuje had seized Holun from a Merkit man named Childu, essentially kidnapping her to be his wife. This was not unusual on the steppe, where raiding for women was a common practice, but it left the Merkits with a debt of dishonor they had not forgotten. They attacked Temujin's camp in the night. Temujin escaped into the darkness, fleeing up into the forests on the slopes of a sacred mountain called Burkhan Khaldun. But in the chaos of the escape, Bort was left behind. The Merkits took her. She was given to Childu's brother as a wife, a direct act of vengeance, replacing what had been stolen with something stolen in return. Temujin was devastated, or at least, that is what the sources tell us, and we have reason to believe it, because his response was not the cautious, calculating move of a man who has written off a lost asset. He threw himself into planning her rescue with a ferocity that suggests genuine anguish. He went to Togrul. He went to another powerful ally, a man named Jamaka, who was Temujin's own Anda, his sworn blood brother and childhood friend. Together, the three men assembled a force and struck the Merkit camp in the night, overwhelming them completely. The Merkits fled into the darkness, and Bort was found and returned to her husband. She was pregnant when she came back. The child she carried, a boy who would be named Jachai, may have been Temujin's son, or may have been fathered by the Merkit who held her. This question was never publicly answered, not by Temujin, not by Bort, not by anyone. Temujin acknowledged Jachai as his own son and treated him as such, though in later years there would be whispers and tensions around Jachai's status that would have tragic consequences. The rescue of Bort was the first real military success of Temujin's adult life. He had called in his alliances, organized an attack, and achieved his objective. It demonstrated that he could lead, that he could inspire men to follow him into the chaos of night raids and dawn attacks, and it added to his growing reputation as a man of action, a man who did not accept defeat or loss without fighting back. Part 2: The Rise. Chapter 6: The Brotherhood That Broke. For a time after the rescue of Bort, Temujin and Jamaka rode together, their camps combined, their followers sharing the same grazing grounds and fire pits. They were the closest of friends, so close that they slept under the same blanket, that the sources compare their bond to the reunion of two lost halves of a whole. But the steppe was not large enough for two great ambitions, and ambition was the one thing that Temujin and Jamaka shared in abundance. After roughly a year and a half of traveling together, the two men parted ways. The secret history tells the story in a way that suggests it was Bort who encouraged Temujin to separate from his Anda, sensing that prolonged association with Jamaka's growing power would ultimately be dangerous. There is also the simpler explanation of incompatible leadership styles. Jamaka favored a traditional, aristocratic structure for steppe society, one where birth and clan determined status. Temujin had been developing a different vision, one where loyalty and ability mattered more than bloodline, where men of talent could rise regardless of where they had been born. This was a revolutionary idea on the steppe, and it attracted followers in a way that frightened the established order. When Temujin and Jamaka parted, something significant happened. Many of Jamaka's followers chose to go with Temujin instead, not because Temujin demanded it, but because they chose it. Aristocrats and commoners alike, men who saw in Temujin something they wanted to follow. Jamaka noticed, and his feelings about Temujin began to curdle from love and rivalry into something darker. In the years that followed the split, Temujin continued to grow. He made alliances, won battles, incorporated defeated enemies into his own forces rather than simply killing them. This was another revolutionary practice. On the steppe, when you defeated a rival tribe, you typically killed the men, enslaved the women and children, and took the herds. Temujin did things differently. He killed the leaders who had fought against him, yes, but he offered the ordinary fighters a choice: join his force and be treated as equals or leave. Many joined. His army swelled. By the late 1180s, Temujin was powerful enough that a gathering of clans, a great assembly called a Kurultai, acclaimed him as Khan of his people. He was given the title Genghis Khan, though the precise meaning and origin of this title have been debated by scholars for centuries. The most common interpretation is that it means something like universal ruler or oceanic ruler, suggesting dominion that extended as far as the ocean extended, which is to say, without limit. He was perhaps in his late 20s. He had gone from a hungry, abandoned child hiding roots from the riverbank to the recognized ruler of a confederation of Mongol tribes. But he was nowhere near done. Chapter 7: The Wars of Unification. The Mongolian plateau in the late 12th century was a complicated and violent place. Dozens of tribes and clans competed for grazing lands, water sources, trade routes, and prestige. Alliances shifted constantly. This year's ally was next year's enemy. Children were given in marriage to seal agreements that might last a generation or might collapse within months. Raids and counter-raids were the rhythm of life. Into this chaos, Temujin began to impose something like order. Not the order of peace, not yet, but the order of his own expanding power. His first major campaign after being acclaimed Khan was a series of strikes against the Tatars, the people who had poisoned his father. He defeated them in a series of battles that were brutal and systematic. After the final Tatar defeat, Temujin called his generals together and announced a policy that shocked even his own followers. All Tatar men who were taller than the linchpin of a cartwheel, the axle hub, were to be killed. Women and children would be incorporated into the Mongol Confederation. This policy of measuring men against a wheel and killing those who were old enough to bear arms was efficient and horrifying, and it effectively ended the Tatars as an independent political force. From the Tatars, Temujin took wives, including a woman named Yesugin and her sister Yesui, who became important figures in his household. He then turned his attention to other rivals. The Taychiat, who had held him captive as a child, were defeated and their leaders killed. The Naimans, a powerful Western confederation, were brought to battle and broken. The Karaits, the tribe of his patron Togrul, would be next, though that conflict came with a particular pain. Togrul had been Temujin's patron and protector for years. The older man was a Christian, a member of the Nestorian church that had spread across Central Asia along the Silk Road, and he was known to the medieval world beyond the steppe by a name that would give rise to the legend of Prester John, the mythical Christian king said to rule somewhere in the east. Togrul had sheltered Temujin, fought alongside him, and shared in his victories. But as Temujin grew stronger, Togrul grew more anxious. He had two sons who stood to inherit his position, and they were not eager to see their father's greatest ally become their father's master. Intrigue followed. Plots were hatched, abandoned, revived. Messages were sent and intercepted. Eventually, the relationship fractured beyond repair, and the two former allies went to war. Temujin defeated Togrul in 1203. The old Khan fled, was killed by strangers who did not recognize him, and his head was brought to Temujin. The Karait people were absorbed into the growing Mongol Confederation. Togrul's Christian faith meant that many of his people were already Christian, and this diversity of religion within the Confederation was something Temujin would carry forward into his empire, a policy of tolerance that was as pragmatic as it was unusual. By 1206, Temujin had done the seemingly impossible. He had unified the warring tribes of the Mongolian plateau under his single authority. Every major rival was defeated, dead, or allied. The Confederation was not merely an alliance of convenience but a structured organization, with a legal code, a military hierarchy, a postal and intelligence system, and a shared identity. At a great Kurultai held on the banks of the Anan River, near the place of his birth, the assembled leaders of the unified Mongol people acclaimed him once more. This time, the title carried the weight of true supremacy. Genghis Khan, the universal ruler. He was perhaps 44 years old. Chapter 8: The New Order. The proclamation of Genghis Khan as supreme ruler of the Mongols in 1206 was not merely a political event. It was the founding of a new kind of society. The legal code he promulgated, known as the Yasa, was a set of laws and decrees that governed Mongol behavior in everything from military discipline to environmental protection. The Yasa forbade the contamination of water sources, recognizing that clean water was the lifeblood of the steppe. It mandated the sharing of food with travelers in need. It prescribed death for spying, for betrayal, for desertion in battle, and for a range of other offenses. It also established a code of conduct for conquered peoples that was, by the standards of the time, relatively tolerant. Those who submitted peacefully would be left in peace, allowed to practice their religions, follow their customs, and live their lives under Mongol sovereignty. Those who resisted would face something else entirely. The military system Temujin established was a masterpiece of organization. He divided his forces into units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000 men. These units crossed clan and tribal lines, deliberately mixing men from different backgrounds, breaking up the old tribal loyalties that might otherwise have led to fragmentation. A man's unit was his family now. His loyalty was to his commander, and his commander's loyalty was to Genghis Khan. Promotion was strictly on merit. A man who performed well in battle, who showed intelligence and courage, who proved loyal and capable, could rise from the lowest rank to command thousands. Birth meant nothing. A slave who fought bravely could become a general. This was shocking to the traditional steppe aristocracy, but it worked. It produced an army of extraordinary cohesion and flexibility, one where every man understood the overall strategic objective and could act intelligently even when separated from higher command. He also established an elite personal guard, the Keshig, which served as both his bodyguard and a training ground for future commanders. Young men of talent from across the Confederation were sent to serve in the Keshig, learning at the center of power, absorbing the methods and vision of the Khan himself before going back out to command their own forces. Intelligence was another pillar of the system. Before any major campaign, Genghis Khan gathered information obsessively. He sent agents, merchants, spies, and diplomats ahead of his armies to learn the terrain, the strength of defenses, the political divisions within enemy societies, the location of water and pasture. He understood that information was a weapon as powerful as any bow or sword, and he used it accordingly. The Mongol army was also remarkably mobile. Where conventional armies of the time moved at the pace of their slowest elements, the Mongols traveled light and fast. Each warrior had multiple horses, allowing him to switch mounts and maintain a pace that was simply stunning to enemies who could not comprehend how an army that size could appear where they least expected it. They could cover distances in days that other armies would have taken weeks to cross. Part 3: The Conquests. Chapter 9: The Zaizia and the First Campaign South. With the Mongolian steppe unified under his authority, Genghis Khan turned his eyes outward. To the south, beyond the Gobi Desert, lay the kingdoms and empires of the settled world. The Zaizia state of the Tangut people, the Jin dynasty of northern China, the Song dynasty of southern China, and beyond them, the vast Islamic world stretching from Persia to the shores of the Mediterranean. He began with the Zaizia. The Zaizia were a Buddhist state that had grown prosperous, controlling key sections of the Silk Road. They had a sophisticated culture, their own script, impressive cities, and a capable army. They were also, in Genghis Khan's estimation, the logical first target, close enough to reach easily, wealthy enough to reward conquest, and connected to the Jin dynasty in ways that made subduing them strategically important before turning east. The Mongol campaigns against the Zaizia began in 1205 and continued intermittently for years. The Mongols were devastatingly effective in open battle, but they encountered something unexpected in their first major campaigns against sedentary civilizations: walls, and more specifically, walled cities. The Mongols had not yet developed the expertise in siege warfare that would later make them so terrifying to fortified cities. In their early campaigns against the Zaizia, they could raid and ravage the countryside, destroying crops and herds and killing anyone who ventured outside the walls, but the cities themselves could hold out. This was a problem. Genghis Khan was not a man who ignored problems. He adapted. He incorporated captured engineers into his forces. He studied the machines of siege warfare that the settled civilizations had developed: the trebuchet, the ballista, the battering ram, the movable siege tower. He brought in Chinese engineers who understood how to build and operate these devices. And gradually, painfully, his army developed into a force capable not just of stunning mobility and archery, but of systematic siege and reduction of fortified positions. The Zaizia ruler eventually submitted and agreed to pay tribute, acknowledging Mongol overlordship. He also promised to provide troops for future campaigns. This submission was accepted, though the Zaizia would later prove unreliable, a decision that would have catastrophic consequences. Chapter 10: The Jin Dynasty and the Wall of China. The Jin Dynasty, ruled by the Jurchen people who had conquered northern China a century earlier, was one of the great powers of the medieval world. Their capital, Jiangdu, was a city of enormous wealth and sophistication, home to perhaps 1 million people, defended by walls of stone and earth that stretched for miles. The Jin had an army of perhaps 1 million soldiers, supplemented by formidable frontier defenses including sections of the Great Wall. Genghis Khan invaded Jin territory in 1211. What followed was not a quick victory. The Mongols could defeat Jin armies in the field with brutal efficiency, using their superior mobility, their feigned retreats, and their devastating archery. They swept through the countryside, destroyed farms and villages, captured tens of thousands of prisoners. But the great cities held. Jiangdu, the Jin capital, did not fall for years. The campaigns against Jin lasted a decade, and during that time the Mongols learned and adapted continuously. They brought in more siege engineers, including Chinese, Khitan, and eventually Persian and Islamic specialists. They developed more sophisticated supply systems to sustain long campaigns far from the steppe. They learned to coordinate infantry, cavalry, engineers, and artillery in ways that had no precedent in steppe warfare. But the most important thing they learned was strategic patience. Genghis Khan was not in a hurry. He could devastate the countryside, cutting off a city's food supply, and wait. Jiangdu fell in 1215, after years of siege and blockade, its population reduced by famine and plague. The Mongols sacked it thoroughly. The Jin dynasty was weakened but not yet destroyed. Mopping up the remnants would take years more and would not be completed until after Genghis Khan's death. But the pattern was established. The settled civilizations of the south and west were not invincible. They could be beaten, besieged, and broken. Chapter 11: The Western Campaign and Khwarizm. While the wars against Jin were still ongoing, something happened to the west that would redirect the full force of Mongol power in a direction no one had anticipated. The Khwarizm Empire, ruled by Shah Muhammad II, was at that time one of the most powerful Islamic states in the world. It stretched from the Caspian Sea to the Persian Gulf, from Afghanistan to the borders of Anatolia. Its cities, Samarkand, Bukhara, Urgench, Merv, were among the greatest urban centers of the medieval world, places of extraordinary learning, art, architecture, and commerce. Samarkand was perhaps the greatest city on the Silk Road, a place where merchants from China met merchants from the Mediterranean, where scholars debated theology and mathematics and astronomy under the light of oil lamps in great libraries that held hundreds of thousands of manuscripts. In 1218, Genghis Khan sent a trading caravan of perhaps 500 merchants and envoys to the Khwarezm Shah, along with a message proposing peaceful trade and diplomatic relations. This was not simply goodwill. Trade along the Silk Road was enormously profitable, and Genghis Khan, who had grown up in poverty on the steppe, understood the value of commerce. He wanted access to the goods and wealth that flowed along the great trade routes. The Khwarezm Shah's governor of the border city of Otrar, a man named Inalchuq, made a catastrophic decision. Whether from greed, from suspicion that the merchants were actually spies, or from a political calculation that the Shah would reward bold action against the Mongols, Inalchuq had the entire caravan seized. The merchants were accused of espionage, and they were executed. Their goods were confiscated. When Genghis Khan received word of what had happened, he sent an embassy to the Khwarezm Shah directly, demanding justice, demanding the surrender of Inalchuq, demanding acknowledgement that an intolerable wrong had been done. The Shah killed or mutilated the ambassadors and sent them back. This was one of the most consequential decisions in the history of the medieval world. The Shah did not know, could not have fully understood, what he had awakened. Genghis Khan reportedly climbed the sacred mountain Burkhan Khaldun, the mountain where he had hidden as a young man during the Murkid attack, and he prayed for 3 days. He acknowledged that he had not sought this war, that the fault lay with the Khwarezm Shah, and he asked Tengri for victory. Then he descended the mountain and began to prepare. The army he assembled for the Western campaign was the largest the Mongols had ever fielded, perhaps 100,000 warriors, supported by siege trains, supply columns, and specialist units. He left a holding force to continue operations against the Jin, gave command to his most trusted generals, and rode west. What followed, from 1219 to 1221, was one of the most devastating military campaigns in human history. The Mongols moved with their characteristic speed and struck where they were least expected. The Khwarezm Shah's strategy relied on distributing his forces among his many fortified cities, hoping to bleed the Mongols in a series of sieges. Instead, the Mongol forces simply overwhelmed each city in turn, moving faster than the Shah could respond. The city of Otrar, whose governor had ordered the massacre of the caravan, was besieged and captured. Inalchuq himself was caught and executed, reportedly by having molten silver poured into his eyes and ears, a death whose poetic brutality reflected the Mongol sense of proportional vengeance. Bukhara, one of the greatest cities of the Islamic world, was taken. Genghis Khan rode his horse into the great mosque of Bukhara and stood before the assembled citizens and religious leaders. According to some accounts, he declared to them that he was the punishment of God, come upon them for their sins. Whether or not he actually said these words, the image captures something real about how his contemporaries experienced the Mongol conquest, as a visitation of divine wrath, as something that could not be explained in ordinary human terms. Samarkand, the jewel of Central Asia, fell. Despite its enormous population and formidable defenses, it fell within days. The garrison attempted to negotiate, attempted to resist, and ultimately neither strategy saved them. The Shah himself fled, pursued across Persia and Central Asia by a Mongol strike force of perhaps 30,000 men under generals Jib and Subadeh, one of the most dramatic pursuits in military history. He was chased to an island in the Caspian Sea, where he died of pleurisy, a broken man, his empire destroyed, his family captured. His son Jalal al-Din attempted to carry on the resistance and proved himself a formidable opponent, inflicting one of the few tactical defeats on a Mongol force at the Battle of Parwan. But Genghis Khan himself came to deal with Jalal al-Din, defeated him at the Battle of the Indus, and watched as the prince plunged his horse into the river and swam across under Mongol arrows, escaping into India. Genghis Khan is said to have watched this with something approaching admiration. A man willing to fight that hard to escape that boldly was a man worth respecting, even if he was an enemy. The cities of Khorasan, the great cultural heartland of the Persian world, were systematically destroyed. Merv, which had been one of the largest cities in the world with a population that medieval sources suggest was in the hundreds of thousands, was taken and its population massacred. Nishapur was destroyed so completely that the Mongols reportedly stacked the skulls of its dead in pyramids. Herat was taken, spared initially, then destroyed after a revolt. The archaeological record confirms what the written sources tell us. Entire city sites show destruction layers from this period that took generations to recover from. The Khwarezm campaign was not simply a conquest. It was, in the regions that resisted, an annihilation. Historians have debated the casualty figures endlessly, and the medieval sources give numbers so astronomical as to be clearly exaggerated. But even discounting for exaggeration, the demographic and cultural damage was profound. Population levels in some parts of Persia and Central Asia did not recover to pre-Mongol levels for a century or more. Irrigation systems that had supported agriculture for thousands of years were destroyed and not rebuilt. A world of sophisticated urban civilization was shattered. And yet in the regions that submitted without resistance, life went on. The Mongols were not interested in destruction for its own sake. They wanted tribute, trade, and order. Cities that opened their gates were spared. Their administrators were often kept in place, their merchants protected. The Mongol peace, the Pax Mongolica, was real in those places, even if its foundation was drenched in blood. Chapter 12, Jib and Subadeh, the reconnaissance of the West. While Genghis Khan was completing the reduction of the Khwarezm Empire, he sent his two greatest generals, Jib and Subadeh, on a mission that reads like something from a legend rather than history. They were to pursue the fleeing Shah wherever he went, and beyond that, to scout the lands to the west and north, to gather intelligence on the peoples and kingdoms that lay beyond the horizons of the Mongol world. What followed was one of the most extraordinary military journeys in history. Jib and Subadeh swept through Persia and Azerbaijan, through the Caucasus Mountains, and onto the steppes of southern Russia, where they encountered the Cumans and the armies of the Georgian kingdom. They defeated the Georgians, a Christian kingdom that was one of the great military powers of the region, not once but twice. They pushed north across the Caucasus Mountains into the land of the Alans and Cumans. The Cumans appealed to their neighbors and kin, the princes of Kiev and Rus, the Russian principalities that sprawled across the forests and plains of what is now Ukraine and western Russia. A combined army of Cumans and Russian princes marched south to meet the Mongols. At the Battle of the Kalka River in 1223, Jib and Subadeh destroyed this combined force utterly. The Russian princes who were captured were executed in a manner that had ritual significance for the Mongols. They were laid on the ground, covered with boards, and the Mongol commanders ate their victory feast on top of them, slowly suffocating them. This was not considered cruel by Mongol standards. It was actually a relatively honorable death, since no blood was shed. Then, having devastated southern Russia and demonstrated that the Russian principalities were no more capable of stopping them than anyone else had been, Jib and Subadeh turned around and rode back east, covering thousands of miles to rejoin the main Mongol force. Jib died on the return journey, likely of illness. Subadeh would return to Russia in force, years later, under the banner of a new Khan. Part 4, The Man Behind the Conqueror. Chapter 13, The Private Genghis Khan. We have spent many pages now with the general, the conqueror, the builder of empire. But who was the man? This is a question that the sources make both easier and harder to answer than you might expect. The Secret History of the Mongols, our most intimate source, is an extraordinary document, mythological and psychological in ways that other chronicles from this period are not. It tells us things about Temujin that no court chronicle would normally record. His childhood fears, his moments of doubt, his relationships with friends and enemies and wives. What emerges from these sources is a portrait of a man of immense contradictions. He could be generous to a degree that astonished his followers. He shared the spoils of conquest with extraordinary lavishness, giving away horses, gold, silk, and captured women to his generals and loyal followers with an open hand. Men followed him partly for this reason. Service to Genghis Khan was economically rewarding in a very direct way. He was also capable of terrible cruelty, particularly toward those he considered traitors or those who had humiliated him or his family. The systematic destruction of the Khwarezm Empire was not merely a military campaign. It contained an element of personal vendetta for the murder of his merchants and ambassadors. He was deeply loyal to those who were loyal to him, sometimes to a degree that surprised observers. When a soldier named Jebe, who had shot Genghis Khan's horse out from under him in battle when Jebe was still an enemy, was captured and brought before him, Temujin did not execute this man for the insult. Instead, impressed by his courage in admitting the act, he made him a general. Jebe became one of the greatest Mongol commanders. He had a sharp, probing intelligence and a curiosity about the world that is easy to overlook behind the image of the destroyer. He sought out scholars, religious leaders, and wise men from every culture and listened to them. He had long conversations with Taoist monks about the nature of existence and the possibility of immortality, with Nestorian Christians about theology, with Islamic scholars about law and mathematics and medicine. He did not convert to any of their faiths, but he absorbed their knowledge and incorporated their expertise into his empire. He was illiterate, like most of the steppe aristocracy of his time, but he recognized the importance of writing and record-keeping, and he commissioned the development of a Mongol script adapted from the Uyghur writing system, and he had his laws and decrees recorded. He was almost certainly physically imposing, though descriptions vary. Persian and Chinese sources mention his unusual eyes, sometimes described as pale green or gray-green, his tall stature, and his physical presence. He had the lean, weather-hardened body of a man who had spent his life on horseback, moving constantly across open landscapes. He had 4 sons with Bort: Jachai, whose parentage was uncertain; Chagatai, who would become known for his fierce adherence to Mongol tradition; Ojdai, who would succeed his father as Great Khan; and Talyui, the youngest, who commanded the Mongolian homeland forces. He had children with other wives as well, and his genetic legacy, as modern DNA studies have suggested, may have been spread extraordinarily widely across Asia through the generations of conquest. His relationship with Bort seems to have been the central emotional relationship of his adult life, whatever other wives and concubines he took. She traveled with him, advised him, and maintained the household that was the heart of the Mongol court. She outlived him by several years. Chapter 14. The Generals. No single man, however brilliant, could have built what Genghis Khan built alone. He was surrounded by generals and administrators of extraordinary ability, men whom he had identified, promoted, and trusted, men who had repaid that trust with achievements that would have made the careers of any commanders in world history. Subadai Badr was perhaps the greatest of them. A man of humble origins who had risen entirely through merit, Subadai fought in virtually every major Mongol campaign from the unification of the steppe through the conquest of Russia and Eastern Europe. He was the strategic mastermind behind many of the most stunning Mongol victories, the man who planned the simultaneous multi-column invasions that left enemies unable to concentrate their forces, who understood how to use feigned retreats and tactical deceptions in ways that were almost always successful. He lived to a great age, retiring with his achievements secure. Jebe was the arrow, the fastest and most aggressive of the Mongol generals, the man who could pursue and pin an enemy while heavier forces closed in for the kill. His death on the return from the Great Western Reconnaissance was mourned deeply. Mukhali was the general left in command of the ongoing campaign against the Jin dynasty, while Genghis Khan went west. He fought brilliantly for years with reduced forces, maintaining pressure on the Jin and making conquests of his own. When he died in 1223, still fighting, Genghis Khan is said to have mourned him as he had mourned few others. Jelmi and Bigorchu were among the oldest and most faithful of Genghis Khan's companions, men who had been with him since the early days of poverty and hardship. They were rewarded with honors that elevated their families for generations. Bigorchu had famously helped Temujin recover stolen horses when they were both young men, the beginning of a friendship that lasted a lifetime. Genghis Khan later said that Bigorchu and Mukhali were his two greatest supporters, the right and left hands of his ambition. Chapter 15. The question of legacy during life. As Genghis Khan grew older, in his late 50s and into his 60s, the question of succession became increasingly urgent. The Mongol system required that all major decisions, including the choice of a successor, be made by Kurultai, by the assembled leaders of the people. But it also operated on the principle that the great Khan should designate his preference. The problem was his sons. Jachai, the eldest, was overshadowed by the uncertainty of his birth. Chagatai, the second son, despised Jachai and made no secret of it, openly questioning the legitimacy of his elder brother. Ojdai was genial, talented, and widely liked. Talyui was the youngest but controlled the homeland forces and was associated with the most traditional Mongol practices. Genghis Khan resolved the succession question by designating Ojdai as his heir, a decision that required Jachai and Chagatai and Talyui all to agree to support. He arranged for the empire to be divided among his sons in a complex system of appanages, territories that each son and later grandson would control, while the overarching authority of the great Khan held the whole together. Whether this system was wise or ultimately unsustainable is one of the great questions of Mongol history. It worked well enough during the reigns of the immediate successors. Eventually, it would lead to the fragmentation of the empire into separate khanates, but that lay in the future. Part 5. The final campaign and the death of the Khan. Chapter 16. The return to Zaizia. The Zaizia, the Tangut Buddhist state that had been one of Genghis Khan's first conquests and had submitted to Mongol overlordship, had failed to provide the military support they had promised during the Western campaigns. This was not something Genghis Khan forgot or forgave. In 1226, already in his early 60s and reportedly struggling with health issues following injuries sustained in a fall from a horse during a hunting expedition, Genghis Khan launched his final campaign against the Zaizia. The campaign was devastating. The Mongols swept across the Zaizia lands like a fire across dry grass, destroying cities, ravaging the countryside and breaking whatever resistance remained. The Zaizia ruler attempted to negotiate, then to resist, then to negotiate again. None of it mattered. Genghis Khan did not live to see the final destruction of the Zaizia capital. In the summer of 1227, somewhere on campaign, Genghis Khan died. The exact cause of his death is unknown. The sources are deliberately vague, either because his followers did not want to publicize any weakness or because genuine uncertainty surrounded the circumstances. Some historians believe he died of injuries from his hunting fall the previous year, made worse by the rigors of campaign. Some suggest typhoid fever. Some Chinese sources hint at other possibilities. A later tradition among some Tangut peoples claims that a captured Zaizia queen killed him in some way, though this is almost certainly legend. He was in his early to mid-60s. He had been Great Khan for over 20 years. He had conquered more territory in his lifetime than any individual before him. His body was carried back to Mongolia for burial. According to custom, everyone who encountered the funeral cortege along the way was killed to preserve secrecy about the route. The exact location of his burial was never recorded, and it has never been found. This was by design. He wanted no monument, no pilgrimage site, no place where his enemies could come to dishonor his grave. He wanted to return to the earth quietly, to become part of the steppe that had made him. His grave remains undiscovered to this day. Chapter 17. The World He Left Behind. When Genghis Khan died in 1227, his empire stretched from the Pacific coast of China to the Caspian Sea. It was already the largest contiguous land empire in history, and it was not yet finished growing. Under his successors, particularly his son Ojdai and his grandsons Monk, Kublai and Hulagu, the Mongol Empire continued to expand. Ojdai completed the conquest of the Jin dynasty in 1234. Hulagu destroyed the Abbasid Caliphate in 1258 and burned the Great Library of Baghdad, an event that Islamic civilization has mourned for centuries. Kublai Khan conquered the Song dynasty of southern China and became the founder of the Yuan dynasty, the setting for the famous visit of Marco Polo. Badu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, completed the conquest of Russia and invaded Poland and Hungary, reaching the Adriatic coast before turning back. At its greatest extent, the Mongol Empire encompassed roughly 24 million square kilometers, or 9 million square miles. It contained perhaps 100 million people. It connected, however brutally, the civilizations of East Asia, Central Asia, the Middle East, and Eastern Europe in ways that accelerated the exchange of goods, ideas, diseases, and technologies. The Silk Road, under Mongol control, became safer and more traveled than it had been in generations, because the Mongols enforced peace within their territories with an iron hand. This enforced peace, the Pax Mongolica, lasted perhaps a century. It facilitated the transmission of plague from Central Asia to Europe along the trade routes, contributing to the Black Death that would kill perhaps a third of Europe's population in the 14th century. It also facilitated the transmission of paper-making, printing, gunpowder, and other technologies from China to the West. The Mongol century was a time of horror and connectivity simultaneously. Destruction and transmission wound together so tightly that they cannot be separated. Part 6. The Echo of the Khan. Chapter 18. How History Has Remembered Genghis Khan. The memory of Genghis Khan has been profoundly contested across the centuries since his death, shaped and reshaped by the purposes of those doing the remembering. In the Islamic world, where the Mongol conquests were experienced as catastrophic, as the end of a golden age of civilization, Genghis Khan was long remembered as a destroyer, an agent of divine punishment perhaps, but a destroyer nonetheless. The destruction of Baghdad in 1258, the killing of the last Abbasid caliph, the burning of its libraries, these were wounds that did not heal quickly. In China, where the Yuan dynasty established by his grandson Kublai Khan was eventually overthrown and replaced by the native Ming dynasty, Genghis Khan was remembered in complex ways, sometimes as a conqueror who had humiliated China, sometimes as the founder of a dynasty that had, whatever its origins, ruled China in Chinese fashion for nearly a century. In Mongolia itself, the memory of Genghis Khan is an entirely different matter. He is the founding father, the creator of the Mongolian nation, the man who took a collection of impoverished, warring clans and forged them into a people who shook the world. During the period of Soviet domination of Mongolia in the 20th century, his memory was officially suppressed, discouraged, seen as a dangerous nationalist symbol. When Mongolia became independent again in 1990, the reverence for Genghis Khan exploded back to the surface. Today his face is on Mongolian currency. A massive statue of him on horseback rises 40 meters into the sky east of the capital Ulaanbaatar. The main international airport is named for him. He is, without question, the greatest hero of Mongolian national identity. In the West, Genghis Khan has gone through several stages of interpretation. For centuries, he was simply the destroyer, the barbarian, the yellow peril made historical flesh. In the 20th century, as historians began to examine the Mongol Empire with more nuance, a different picture began to emerge. Of a ruler who, while undeniably brutal, also built something remarkable, who practiced religious tolerance unusual for his age, who promoted trade and communication across vast distances, who valued merit over birth in ways that were revolutionary. The debate continues. Genghis Khan resists simple moral judgment. He was a man of his time and place, shaped by a world of extraordinary violence and shaped in turn by the opportunities and necessities that world presented. He was also, by any measure, one of the most consequential individuals in human history, a man whose decisions and campaigns affected the lives of hundreds of millions of people across generations. Chapter 19: The Genetic Legacy. In 2003, a team of geneticists published a paper in the American Journal of Human Genetics that sent shockwaves through the historical and scientific communities. They had discovered that approximately 16 million men alive today, roughly 0.5% of the global male population, share a particular Y chromosome lineage that traces back to a common ancestor who lived in Mongolia roughly 1,000 years ago. This lineage is found in its highest concentrations precisely in the regions that were at the heart of the Mongol Empire, and the territories from which the ruling family drew its wives, concubines, and the mothers of its countless children. The implication, which the researchers were careful to phrase as a possibility rather than a certainty, is that this lineage descends from Genghis Khan himself or from a close male relative. If this is correct, then Genghis Khan is the most successful progenitor in recorded human history. His genetic descendants number in the tens of millions. The biological legacy of the man who was born in a felt tent on the banks of the Annan River lives on in people scattered across Central Asia, China, the Middle East, and Eastern Europe. This finding has been debated and refined since the original paper was published, but its essential thrust has held up. The Mongol ruling class left an extraordinary genetic imprint on the populations of the regions they conquered and controlled, and the man at the center of that ruling class left the largest imprint of all. Chapter 20: The Philosophy of the Khan. Was Genghis Khan a philosopher? In any formal sense, no. He was not a man who wrote treatises or debated in academies, but he held a coherent worldview that shaped everything he did, and it is worth trying to articulate it. At the center of his worldview was the conviction that Tengri, the eternal blue sky, had given him a mandate to rule the world. This was not mere propaganda, though it served propaganda purposes. It appears to have been something he genuinely believed. The idea that he was the instrument of divine gave him both his extraordinary confidence and his terrible capacity for destruction. If the sky had chosen him, then those who resisted him were resisting the will of heaven, and their destruction was not merely politically convenient but cosmically justified. This conviction also gave him a framework for tolerance. If Tengri was universal, then all peoples, whatever gods they worshipped, were ultimately under the same sky. Christian, Muslim, Buddhist, Taoist, Shamanist, all were subjects of the same cosmic order. Persecuting them for their beliefs made no sense, and more practically, alienating the religious communities of conquered peoples made them harder to govern. Genghis Khan's policy of religious tolerance was born from pragmatism and worldview simultaneously. He also believed deeply in loyalty as the supreme virtue and betrayal as the supreme sin. The men he rewarded most were those who had been loyal at cost, who had stood by him when it would have been easier to leave, who had refused to betray him even under pressure. The men he punished most severely were traitors, not because betrayal had necessarily hurt him personally, but because betrayal was the rot that destroyed communities, the poison that made no social order possible. He valued competence. He valued directness. He valued the ability to act decisively under pressure. He had little patience for men who made excuses or who failed to deliver what they had promised. And he valued, in his way, knowledge. He was not an intellectual, but he was endlessly curious, and he used the knowledge of others with extraordinary pragmatic intelligence, incorporating the best practices of every civilization he encountered into the growing machinery of his empire. Epilogue: drifting toward sleep. Let us return now to the steppe. It is night. It is always night when the steppe is at its most itself. The sky above is a canopy of stars so thick they seem to press down toward the earth, close enough to touch if you stood on your horse's back and reached up. The wind moves through the grasses with a sound like breathing. Like the breathing of something enormous and ancient and patient. Somewhere out there, under this same sky, Temujin once lay in the cold and listened for the sound of enemies coming in the dark. Somewhere under this sky, he crouched in a river with a wooden collar around his neck and waited for his captor to pass him by. Somewhere under this sky, he prayed before the battle that would make him master of half the world. The steppe has forgotten him, as it forgets everything eventually. The grass grows over the places where his armies camped. The rivers that he forded have shifted their courses. The cities he destroyed have been built and destroyed again by other hands in other centuries. His grave is out there somewhere, unmarked and undisturbed, returning slowly to the earth from which everything comes and to which everything returns. And yet he is not forgotten. He lives in the faces of millions of people who carry his blood without knowing it. He lives in the borders of nations shaped by the empire he built. He lives in the trade routes that his peace made possible, in the transmission of technologies that his conquests facilitated, in the ideas about law and governance and religious tolerance that his successors inherited and sometimes improved upon. He lives, most of all, in the stories, in the secret history of the Mongols, that strange and intimate chronicle written by someone close to his court, preserving the voice of a man who was lost and hungry and afraid before he was mighty. In the chronicles of Rashid al-Din, the Persian minister who compiled the most comprehensive account of the Mongol world. In the reports of William of Rubruck and John of Plano Carpini, the European friars who traveled to the Mongol court and wrote back to a stunned Europe about what they found. In the account of Marco Polo, who visited the court of Genghis Khan's grandson and described a civilization of extraordinary sophistication and wealth. In the stories that Mongolian grandparents still tell their grandchildren, sitting by the fire in the Jura, while the wind moves through the grass outside. This is where history lives, not in the grand monuments or the official narratives or the academic debates, but in the stories passed from voice to ear across the generations, in the quiet hours before sleep, when the mind is open and the past seems close. Close your eyes now. The steppe breathes around you. The stars are impossibly close. The wind carries nothing but the smell of grass and cold air and the faint, ancient memory of horse and fire, and the sound of a great people moving across the earth. Sleep now, the story is told. The grass grows, the wind blows, the sky endures. And somewhere out there, under the eternal blue, the greatest conqueror the world has ever known lies quietly in the earth and is at peace. Historical notes and further context. Sources and methodology. The primary sources for the life of Genghis Khan are limited but extraordinary. The Secret History of the Mongols, composed shortly after his death, probably around 1228 or a few years later, is the most intimate and detailed account we have. It reads like a combination of oral epic and court chronicle, preserving stories, speeches, and character details that no official history would normally include. It was discovered by Western scholars only in the 19th century and has been translated and studied intensively ever since. Rashid al-Din Hamadani, the Persian statesman and scholar who served in the Mongol court of the Ilkhanate in the late 13th and early 14th centuries, compiled his compendium of chronicles at the direction of the Mongol rulers, drawing on Mongolian oral traditions and written records. It remains the most comprehensive medieval account of the Mongol Empire. Chinese chronicles from the Jin and Yuan dynasties provide important perspectives on the Mongol conquests from the eastern end. Persian and Islamic chronicles from Central Asia and Persia record the Western campaigns with a perspective shaped by the experience of conquest, and often by profound grief and anger. European accounts from the 13th century, particularly those of John of Plano Carpini and William of Rubruck, provide outside perspectives on the Mongol court from writers who were not subjects of the empire. The archaeology of the empire. Archaeological work in Mongolia, China, Central Asia, and Eastern Europe continues to add to our understanding of the Mongol world. Surveys of the destruction layers in cities like Merv, Nishapur, and Jiangdu confirm the scale of the devastation described in written sources. Studies of Mongol burial practices have illuminated aspects of their ritual life. DNA research has provided new perspectives on population movements and the genetic impact of the conquests. The search for the tomb of Genghis Khan continues, though it has been complicated by the wishes of many Mongolians who feel that the site, if found, should not be excavated but left undisturbed out of respect. The debate about numbers. Historians continue to debate the death tolls of the Mongol conquests. Medieval sources give numbers that are almost certainly exaggerated, chronicles claiming that millions were killed in single cities, that populations were annihilated to the last person. Modern demographic and archaeological analysis suggests that the actual death tolls, while enormous, were not quite at the levels the sources claim, and that in many places the population recovered within a generation or two. The most affected regions appear to have been parts of Khorasan and northeastern Persia, where the destruction of irrigation systems combined with massacre to produce genuine demographic collapse lasting generations. Central Asian cities like Merv and Urgench were devastated in ways that permanently altered the settlement patterns of the region. In China, the demographic impact of the conquests and the subsequent Mongol rule appears to have been significant but less extreme, partly because the Mongols needed the Chinese administrative and agricultural system to function in order to extract the revenue and goods that made their empire prosperous. The legacy of law. The Yasa, Genghis Khan's legal code, has been the subject of considerable scholarly debate because no complete version of it survives. What we know of it comes from fragmentary references in Persian, Chinese, and other sources. Scholars have attempted to reconstruct its provisions from these fragments, but the picture remains incomplete. What is clear is that it represented a significant attempt to create a common legal framework for the diverse peoples of the empire, an attempt to replace the arbitrary power of local rulers with something more consistent and predictable. Whether it succeeded in this aim across the vast distances of the empire is another question. The Pax Mongolica and the Silk Road. One of the most significant and underappreciated legacies of the Mongol Empire is the period of relative stability and connectivity it imposed across Eurasia from roughly the 1250s to the 1340s. During this period, travel and trade along the Silk Road were facilitated by a common imperial authority that provided security, postal relay stations, and a common currency system in some regions. This connectivity had enormous consequences. The exchange of goods accelerated. New technologies moved along the trade routes. Ideas and artistic influences crossed from east to west and back again. The art of the Yuan dynasty in China shows clear Persian and Islamic influences. Persian art shows Chinese influences. European merchants and diplomats reached China for the first time in centuries. And the plague moved west along the same routes, carried in the furs and goods of Central Asian merchants, reaching the Crimea in the 1340s and from there spreading to Europe. The Black Death, which killed perhaps 25 million Europeans in a few years, was in part a consequence of the connectivity the Mongol Empire had created. History, as always, offers no simple ledgers of good and bad. The Mongol Empire brought catastrophe and connectivity, destruction and cultural exchange, death and new life, simultaneously and inseparably. Closing reflection. Genghis Khan was born into a world of struggle and died as the ruler of half the known world. Between those two facts lies one of the most extraordinary life stories in human history, a story of survival, ambition, brilliance, cruelty, loyalty, betrayal, love, and conquest that has few parallels in any era. He was not a simple man, and history does him no favors when it reduces him to a symbol, whether of barbarian destruction or of Mongolian national pride. He was a full human being, shaped by extraordinary circumstances, who shaped the world around him with a force that few individuals have ever matched. The steppe wind blows, the stars wheel overhead. The grass bends and rises and bends again. And the story continues to be told.